All right, good morning.
Good
Stewart.
morning.
How are you?
Fine, thank you.
Thank you for taking the time to do this interview.
Sure.
Stewart, your family has had a long history in this country, and your great-grandfather was a miner in New Mexico, and your grandfather was a tailor. You've related in the past a story about how you encountered, I think it was a waitress in North Carolina who asked you where you were from. Would you mind relating that story?
Yes. I was working on a civil rights case in North Carolina, and a white waitress came up to me at a restaurant and was taking my order, and then she said, "Well, where are you from? Where's your family from?" So I thought about my mother's side of the family, and my great-grandfather was a miner in New Mexico. My grandfather was he turned to be a herbalist, but he was a tailor in Stockton and Oakland, and my mother was born in Stockton, California. And the waitress stopped me without any hesitation and said, "And how do you like your new country?" And so I was thinking, maybe she's thinking about California, because some parts of the country don't think California is part of the United States. But I think Asian Americans find that situation oftentimes where we're seen as the perpetual foreigner. We're not really Americans because we haven't assimilated, but given the color of our skin, that's almost impossible. So I think I've learned through my experience that my two sons, who were born at Kaiser Sunset in Los Angeles, probably will be asked the same question sometime during their lives.
And that certainly is a pretty common question, and I can tell you I've been asked the same question in North Carolina and in Michigan and other places. I'm not sure I've heard that question in San Francisco yet. It certainly is, even today, a feature of being Asian American that one is still seen as a foreigner, no matter whether you speak perfect English or are conventionally successful. You've chosen to take that experience and engage in alliances across ethnicities, across races, uniting different groups. Can you talk about why and what inspires you to do that?
Well, first of all, I think Asian Americans owe a great debt to the civil rights movement, because but for the civil rights movement, the 1965 immigration law, which was really a very restrictive nativist law, would not have been overturned and modified. So I see the civil rights movement as really the reason why we have been able to reunite our families. So it really has not been just a practical reason to unite with Blacks and Latinos. I think there's really a historic reason as well. But I also see that Asian Americans need to understand other minorities, their oppression, how they have either come to the United States or how they're treated in the United States. I think that's fundamental to the Asian American experience. And so I do see that it's important to have alliances, because it is one thing for Asian Americans to object to the way we may be mistreated, but it's also very helpful for Asian American voices to be joined by Black and Latino and other voices in saying Asian Americans should be treated fairly.
You know, Asian Americans have a long history in this country. But it really was the end of the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Civil Rights Movement and that 1965 Act where we started to see families reunited. Today, recent immigrants from Asia may not be as aware of the history of exclusion and how Asian Americans have benefited from the civil rights movement, also affirmative action in the past. I wonder what a good way is to bridge that divide between the experience of recent immigrants and those from decades past.
I think education is key. Almost no schools teach about the true Asian American experience. In fact, I'm working with PBS today. My wife and I are working with PBS, the DC branch, WETA, to produce a 5-hour documentary on Asian Americans, which will include our history, but also current day. And I think it's very important for Asian Americans to understand what we've gone through, how we were treated, how our treatment was similar to other minorities. And so there's really no substitute for that. So we are not only helping to raise money for that project, we're responsible for the curriculum. So we hope hundreds of thousands, if not millions of students will see some of our lesson plans and some of our lessons about the history and the current day situation of Asian Americans. I think that education is so crucial because, one time we were celebrating the Martin Luther King birthday, and a Chinese American reporter asked me, well, why should we celebrate that? What do we have to do with that? I think it was an innocent question, but I got a little mad. I said, well, when did your family come over here? And of course he said after 1970. And I said, but for the civil rights movement, you wouldn't be here today. And so I think it's really incumbent on us who know the history to share that and to figure out different ways to get it across to 20 million Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders that really, but for the civil rights movement, we wouldn't be here today. Most of us wouldn't be here today. So I think that, Asian Americans are 2/3 foreign-born. So of course, and with the schools not teaching Asian American history, we can't really expect our population to really understand what happened. So it's really up to us to share with them the history of immigration, the history of affirmative action, the history of how we were treated. And so I think that that's very important. I think sometimes Asian Americans understand our history to some extent, but they don't really understand how other minorities were treated at the same time and how our destinies are intertwined. So that's incumbent on us too. So that's why we go out of our way to have joint projects with the African American community or with the Latino community or with the LGBTQ community. Those communities really need to be reached out to and joined with us to fight for justice.
I remember Senior Advisor on Immigration, Stephen Miller, give a briefing from the White House press room where he challenged and rejected the notion that we're still a nation of immigrants. Do you have any thoughts on how Asian Americans can help the rest of America see the value of immigrants and our traditional welcoming attitude towards immigrants?
I think Asian Americans play a crucial role in educating all Americans about the importance of immigration. Today, Asian Americans, as I said earlier, are 2/3 foreign-born. So most of us are immigrants. And so it's really incumbent on us to explain what that journey was, the hardships, the successes, the stature that we have today, it's very important not to forget those trials and tribulations, because it's really the most recent story. Asian Americans are the fastest growing ethnic group in the United States of America. We have probably over 40% growth rate. And so that really means that we have to educate people about what that has meant. It's very easy for us to look at the successes and not look at some of the failures or some of the hardships that people have gone through. And so I'm reminded that in, for example, the public charge debate, where people who are getting federal assistance will be knocked out of not only citizenship, but even becoming green card holders. I think that's really a tragedy, and it's really incumbent upon Asian Americans to speak out against really off-centered proposals like public charge, because our population will suffer, but it also means that a lot of Asian Americans won't be able to live out the American dream. There's some Asian Americans who have spoken out for Trump and for what he stands for, and I think it's very important for us to stand up and explain, well, how did we get here? How did we become successful? And I think today, the trade war with China is a reminder of how fragile our existence is in the United States. I mean, we had one official saying that Chinese students could all be spies. I mean, it's really getting to very absurd notions that Chinese are being questioned on their loyalty. And so this is a very important time. The matter of standing up for immigrants becomes a very personal and very current issue. And I think it's very important that Asian Americans speak out.
It strikes me that a lot of people, not in border states, but places like the Midwest, that in those states people might not have too much direct experience with immigrants and immigrant families, but they certainly have formed an opinion.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if there are other ways, practical steps that you think that as Asian American lawyers that we can take to help that conversation.
Well, I think Asian American lawyers have an important role to play. They have a role to help Asian American cases where, for example, Vietnamese and Cambodians are being threatened with deportation as we speak. And so we need help on that front. There's probably 8,000 to 10,000 people affected by what the United States is trying to do, force back, to send back Vietnamese and Cambodians who have served their time. And you know, it's a law that Cambodia and Vietnam don't recognize anymore. But anyway, we need volunteers. We need volunteers for citizenship programs. But I would also say Asian American attorneys have a role to play in helping other minorities as well. So when the children have been detained, Asian American attorneys can really play a very important role to stand up for those young Latino families. And so I think that Asian Americans, especially in states like California, have a very important role to play.
I remember as a college sophomore watching from my dorm room as the LA riots or the civil unrest was unfolding, and watching the coverage of depicting one community, Asians, shooting at another community, African American and Hispanic, and really seemed to be a focus of the press coverage. For some reason, the violence of one community of minorities against another. In that time, you were part of the initial leadership of Rebuild LA, and after 1992, you developed an interethnic relations program where you've trained 1,000 community leaders. What have you found to be the most effective in building trust and moving forward together?
Well, in the 1992 civil unrest, we pressured the LA Times to get a Korean American reporter, Connie Kang, to cover the Asian American viewpoint. And they did hire somebody, Connie Kang. We really objected to the portrayal of Asian Americans like shooters on rooftops. The reality is 2,500 to 3,000 Asian American businesses were burnt down or destroyed. There were many Asian, especially Korean American merchants who had been killed in the prior few years in failed robberies at their stores. So there were a lot of ingredients to the civil unrest. And we really objected to how Asian Americans, particularly Korean Americans, were portrayed in the media. While we certainly defended Asian Americans and Korean Americans in particular, we also wanted to develop bridges. And so we had two different programs that we developed. One was a training program called Leadership Development and Intergroup Relations. It still exists today. And so we would train 50 to 100 people per year, basically on how to collaborate with each other. That, many of the communities had similar challenges, but we didn't know that, and we didn't know how to work together. So we taught people how to understand their prejudices, but also how to work together to improve communities. So at the end of the program, we actually had community projects where people worked together to improve communities. The other project we had was the Multicultural Leadership Alliance. And so we had 15 or 20 people from different communities working together on different issues. And so that was an important program as well. But we wanted to try to find linkages so that people were not estranged from each other.
You've been able to build step by step, taking an idea like the APA Legal Center, where you were a sole employee with some volunteers, and three decades later, you have over 110 employees, hundreds of volunteers, and you've also been able to build collaborations across the city and across the country. I wonder, is there anything that you can share with younger attorneys about taking that long-term vision and being able to hold it in the face of challenges and to build something meaningful like that over time?
Well, first of all, we'd love for younger Asian American attorneys to join us in our operations, both in the Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus Collaborative in the Bay Area and Advancing Justice LA. We would welcome that. But I think that Asian Americans have an important role to play in today's society. And so people have to get used to not being like the silent minority or the passive minority. And yet we need to jump in to help out on different issues, different cases. I think that's really a sign of whether we have come of age, is are we willing to be a good volunteer, or are we willing to be a good staff person?
It's been said about you that you like to build for bigger wins? If that is a belief and a philosophy that you have, can you tell us about that?
Well, early on in my career, I realized that if we didn't institutionalize, meaning if we didn't have a strong institution, we just wouldn't exist for the long term. We wouldn't be sustainable. We would have maybe flash in the pan is probably too brief a description, but we definitely have learned that you have to be around for the long term. You don't know when the attack or the real big issues come up. So I learned you have to really build something that has a growth and sustainability.
You decided early on in law school that you wanted to take a path that brought the community together, that contributed to the community. Thinking back to that moment, how did you know back then in law school that that was right for you?
Well, actually, I realized in undergrad that I wanted to be part of the community and really serve the community. I was the president of the Asian student group in 1970 when the American troops invaded Cambodia. And so we had a rally on campus, and at that time there were many rallies on campus. The National Guard was called in, and I remember being on the rooftop of Campbell Hall, which is the Asian American Studies Center building, and running into the rooms and locking the doors when the troops attacked the building. And I remember hearing a commotion. Later on, we found some American Indian brothers were beaten up. But I realized in trying to bail out some of my members who got arrested that I didn't want to apply for med school. I wanted to apply for law school. And so from an early point in time, I realized what my path was. In law school, I did very well. The first year I was supposed to do law review, but I decided I should really focus on building up legal services and legal aids in our community, because at that time, the legal aids really didn't have Asian programs. The Asian American attorneys just handled everything, but they didn't really have Asian American programs. And then by 1983, when we opened up the Advancing Justice, we called it the Asian Pacific American Legal Center, then President Ronald Reagan cut the legal services budget by 1/3. So we knew there was no hope to expand legal aids. So it was incumbent on us to provide both advocacy and services at the same time.
Can you describe how the Vincent Chin's murder and the subsequent actions relating to prosecutions impacted your work?
Well, we always defined ourselves as a regional organization, but in 1983, I read an article in the LA Times about the Vincent Chin sentencing. The two killers had pled guilty to manslaughter, and so there was a sentencing in the trial, and then the two killers got home on probation and a $3,000 fine. So there were some mass demonstrations, and I read about it in the LA Times, and then I asked my board if I could go out to Detroit to see if I could be helpful. And when I called, people said, come tomorrow, because they wanted help. And so I went out there to Detroit and I assessed the situation, and I said we should try to get a federal civil rights prosecution for hate crimes. And so that became like the focal point of the campaign that a lot of different groups joined. And so I it really influenced advancing justice, not so much because I was able to go there, but partly because I wasn't able to go there. In the trials, the first trial in the federal courts ended up in a conviction of the main culprit, and he got a 25-year sentence. But that was overturned on appeal. And in the subsequent trial that was moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, the almost all-white jury didn't understand the racial motivation involved in the case and acquitted both killers, who never spent a day of their lives in jail for killing Vincent. And I worked with the mother, Lily Chin, to try to get justice. And when she came to Los Angeles, before the Justice Department decided to take on the case, she fainted, and some of us tried to help her to her feet. And later that night, she was staying at my home, a very loving woman. I asked her if she was okay, and she said, "Stewart, there's nothing I can do to bring back Vincent, but I don't want any other mother to go through what I've gone through." And unfortunately, in the second trial, where there was an acquittal of the two killers, who, with a jury who didn't understand the racial motivation in the case, and there was plenty of evidence on racial motivation, Mrs. Chin decided she just couldn't live in the United States anymore and moved back to China. She had lost her husband 6 months before Vincent was killed. Vincent was her only child. And so she never really had a daughter-in-law who had been married to her son, because Vincent had been celebrating his upcoming wedding. Mm-hmm. So it was a big tragedy all around. In 1995, I visited Lily in China, and she was smiling, and but behind her glowing exterior, I could tell she had lost everything in the United States. And so it was very impactful for me, and I think a generation of my peers, because we realized the stakes were very high. People can get killed, but also there could be no justice in those cases. So we really had to be very vigilant, as well as really build up what we could become.
After Vincent Chin, that was a time when a lot of Asian American groups formed, including an organization that I'm a member of, the National APA Bar Association, or NAPABA. At that time, you viewed your organization as a regional organization, but having the experience where you called over to Michigan and they asked you to come the very next day, and you coalesced around a strategy to pursue a federal hate crimes prosecution. I wonder, and I imagine that there might have been conversations that you had with your board at that time about where you needed to go over the next few years.
Yes, I always asked the board for permission to move out, because as you said, we started out as a regional organization, and obviously the Vincent Chin case was national in its scope, and obviously took place in the Midwest. So they said, given the horrific situation in the case, that I should try to go out and help out, because I did have some civil rights experience, and people thought I could be helpful. So my board has always been very supportive of our expansive activities. When I came back to Los Angeles, we started a hate crimes monitoring program, and actually in the mid-1980s, suggested, and actually I wrote the ordinance that had Los Angeles be the first major West Coast city that had hate crimes monitoring. So it included race, national origin, sexual orientation, and gender. So we were able to start effectuating change at a broader scale locally as well. So the impact was huge. And then we started tracking hate crimes against Asian Americans nationally that the Advancing Justice Collaborative took on later on.
The Advancing Justice Collaborative didn't happen overnight, I know, and took at least 7 years, as I understand, to pull together. I have to imagine, I can only imagine what those conversations were like, where you have organizations across the country in Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, DC, elsewhere, that were used to doing things their own way, had a long history of committed community members and leaders. How were you and the leaders able to, sort of set aside, what might be more localized or individualized interests for the purpose of coming together as a collaborative?
Well, it did take 7 or 8 years of constant discussion. My main picture that I presented was there will be more Asian American legal groups, and that if we don't combine, there could be 10, 15 groups, all with different names, no coordination, all competing for a similar set of funding. So I think it was a compelling story, but everybody had their own individual interest and, like you said, their own boards, their own work areas, but more importantly, their own histories. And so it was very hard to convince people that they don't have to lose their histories. It's just that they need to change the name to Asian Americans Advancing Justice. And we settled on, you can have a tag name that is either your old name or your geography, so that people could identify you. So I think that settled some people's fears that they'd lose their histories. But that was the biggest thing, is that people may lose their histories. But I think that now that Asian Americans Advancing Justice has an annual conference, we've had annual conferences for like 9 years now, I think people have gotten used to having a common brand, and we're trying to figure out how to expand beyond the 5 organizations, because it takes a lot of time and effort and funds to build up a full-scale office. But maybe there's something short of that we can figure out in the long term.
Well, having worked in community-based legal organizations, I know it's no small feat to convince people to make a change like that. So that is very, very, it's not a small thing.
Yes.
And one thing that I can tell you is that having lobbied now for a number of years with NAPABA on the Hill, that a question that I get not infrequently from staffers is, what does Advancing Justice think about this? So that branding and that collaboration has been effective.
Yes. Yes, that's a good example, DC. It takes a lot of work to bind the 5 organizations on a common view towards different issues or bills. But if you can imagine 5 separate organizations all trying to lobby for somewhat different bills, it would be a mess. So I think what I try to explain to people sometimes is, yes, there's always bumps along the road, but what the alternative is not pretty, because it would be very competitive and sometimes at cross purposes. So, I think that I'm a very practical person because I know the challenges. I mean, we are bigger than all of the other affiliates put together. So we had the most to lose in terms of notoriety, in terms of what we're about. So I understood those issues, but my board was very supportive from the beginning. I don't know exactly why, but they were all very supportive. And they got the picture very early on, but it did take some convincing.
Another thing that stands out to me about your work is how effective you are at holding collaborations together.
Well, we do believe in coalitions, and currently I'm the last standing executive director on the affiliation group. So staying power is important.
Any other tips that you can offer for activists or community members who are trying to hold coalitions together? Any thoughts or tips on successful coalition building?
Well, I think people need to listen well and listen to what other people have to say. Like, one of the things we've learned is that the new organizations really appreciate advancing justice as a whole, because we really boosted them. We really helped build them up. And so I think that's very important, because if we understand how we're able to help the smaller, newer groups, then that really is kind of a signal that we're doing something right.
Stewart, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask a question about your mother, Beulah.
Sure.
And I know that your mother was born in Stockton. She very well educated, but went to the University of Chicago and was teaching college sociology in Los Angeles when she embarked on a second career in acting. And in that career, she was incredibly prolific, served in played in over 100 roles in television and film. But I have to admit, talk about trailblazer. I have to imagine she had some experiences in her life and in Hollywood, being that first. Were there any experiences that she related to you about her time making that incredible transition?
Well, my mother was always an optimist, so she really saw the bright side of things. I remember at one award ceremony, she was getting some honor, and she mentioned when she was a member of the Methodist Church, she and I guess the youth leader and a number of people were going to Utah to see the Mormon tabernacle. And on the way, somebody spat at them. They were not welcomed at some restaurants. But she found a solace in that it was a very diverse group, so nobody knew who they were really targeting. And so she always was the fighter in the family, fighting for rights and fighting for justice. So she actually had a long history where she was not only acting, but she was organizing for greater opportunities for minority actors and actresses. She helped to co-found the East-West Players, which is the largest Asian American theater company in the country. And so that really was a signal to me that she was more concerned about advancement for our community than about her own career.
And did you ever learn or get a sense of what it was about her experiences that led her to be to advocate and to push for roles for minorities?
Well, I think growing up, she grew up in the Great Depression, and she used to tell me about scrubbing floors for 5 cents an hour. So she went through a lot of hardship. She was Phi Beta Kappa at UC Berkeley, and then got her master's degree at the University of Chicago. So I think from an early stage, she had experienced discrimination and experienced being the other. And so she wanted to change that. So, but she was always an optimist. So I know she, when she tried to help the Mayor B. Rigosa in his first run for mayor, she said, and I'm trying to help Antonio, what about doing a fundraiser? So I said, okay. And then she said, and we're doing it at your home. So she always had a way to figure out, how to get things done, but in a fast and easy way.
Well, I know she played a role in mentoring many young Asian American and minority actors. Last year, a movie came out called Crazy Rich Asians, which is the first, such movie from a Hollywood studio starring a primarily APA cast since the Joy Luck Club. What do you think her reaction would have been to that movie?
I think she would have enjoyed it. She was supposed to be in the Joy Luck Club, but she got sick. So she really had, her opportunities, but she always liked Asian American advancement. And it didn't really matter what the topic was at different times, but if it could advance the Asian American cause, she was for it.
Looking back, it really seemed like she cared as much about advancing the Asian American cause as advancing her own acting career.
Yes. I remember being at some gatherings, or actually big dinners, where she was advocating for the studios to hire more Asian American actors. And I was thinking, wow, that takes a lot of guts, because those are the people who will hire you for your next script. But she was always pushing and saying, you got to open up the field, open up the opportunities, open up the jobs. And so she, had her way.
So I believe you have an uncle by marriage who had the experience of being incarcerated in Japanese American internment camp during World War II.
Yes, Sho Tanimoto was a dentist, and he actually had to open and close his office 3 times because of the whole incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. And I asked Sho at a family gathering, I said, Sho, if you could have predicted this happening, say 5 years beforehand, what was missing from the community? And he said, at least 2 things I remember. There's a third I would add, but he said, we didn't have a strong community organization that could really fight for us. We didn't have Asian American attorneys who could really defend us. And then I would just add that we didn't have strong alliances where people other than Asians would stand up for us. So, I remember his comments, because that's why I wanted to build the Asian Americans Advancing Justice to be a strong organization, because you could have a say on one issue, but then if you go away, what about all the other issues?
And how old were you when you had this conversation with your uncle at a family gathering?
I probably was in my early 30s. Yeah.
And was that one of the inspirations for the vision for the National Collaborative?
Well, definitely. I think it was a little after I started some things, but it was definitely reinforcing a vision I had that, we cannot just be just individuals fighting here and there. We have to have an institution or several institutions that could really stand up. Otherwise, we will fail. And I think the stakes today are very high, and we don't know what's going to come at us. I mean, if some government official thinks that all Chinese students are spies, then we're spies too. And so that it's a very dangerous time.
One of the things that strikes me about this particular moment that we live in is that we're experiencing so much fear, and scapegoating that comes from fear.
Well, it's fear, and in particular, it's against immigrants. So, Asian Americans really have high stakes in that game because it's really aimed at us. It's not just aimed at Latinos, it's aimed at Asian Americans as well. And I think most Asian Americans get that. It's reflected in how they are polled and how they vote. But it is a very serious matter. I mean, there were proposals. The administration has backed off a bit, but there were proposals to really cut legal immigration. There were proposals to cut legal immigration by half. So it was really pretty drastic measures, in addition to birthright citizenship, in addition to, the public charge is still going on. So the stakes are very, very high.
What do you think would be persuasive to that person in Ohio or in Florida that might make that person see Asians as less foreign and immigrants as less of a threat and less hostile?
Well, I mean, I think that Asian Americans need to speak up. They need to educate the broader population about who we are and that we have contributed a lot to this country, but have gone through hardship and immigration hardship. I think people need to advocate for our rights, because sometimes you can't convince people, but you still have those rights. You still have to speak up. So I do think that there's an education and an advocacy function that has to go on simultaneously.
APALC, now Advancing Justice, has recently celebrated 35 years, which is an incredible milestone. Looking forward, what would you want for Advancing Justice to achieve in the next 35 years?
Well, Advancing Justice really, I think, is still a young organization. I compare ourselves to African American and Jewish organizations that are much older. So I think we are still at a very young stage. I think we need our community that can afford it to be more helpful, to come forward and to be helpful. We need to expand our operations to other states, other cities within California as well. We need to be able to have a strong set of litigators as well as people who can advocate on the issues and provide services. So I think there's a lot of room for growth and sustainability.
Stewart, looking back at the organizations you've built and the collaborations that you've built, and really looking back at the span of your work and your life, what makes for a meaningful life?
Well, I think people have to be satisfied with what they've contributed to society as a whole. I don't think people, at least from my viewpoint, are satisfied by monetary gain or by gains of the individual. For me, it's how much we've contributed to the community's growth and to the community's knowledge and to the community's rights. So for me, it's really about community rather than the individual. And so that's what I would look at is, have I contributed to the community's sustenance rather than my own individual gain?
I have to imagine that there will be some people who might view this video who don't live in Los Angeles or a San Francisco or even in a city that's served by an organization like one of the Advancing Justice collaboration partners. To those young APAs in those communities, is there something that you'd like to share with them about your path that might be helpful to them?
Well, I think that is very helpful for them to challenge us to figure out how to incorporate them, how to affiliate, or how to become part of our cause. So people could have their own organization and then be affiliated with Advancing Justice. So I think there's different ways to do that. So people should not, in some cases, people need to start their own organization, but I think that the more unity there is, the better. So challenge us to try to figure out how do we incorporate their interest and their causes in our larger campaign. And so I think that would be very helpful for us because it would force us to figure out how do we incorporate them. We're trying to figure out how do we deal with Fresno, how do we deal with Houston, how do we deal with other communities that are growing. And we haven't figured it out, but I think having the community challenge us to figure it out is very helpful.
Advancing Justice is, I think, in about 5 or 6 cities.
5 cities, yes.
And it strikes me that there is a broader network of APA lawyers, and that's NAPABA alone has 80 affiliates across the country, really in most of the major urban areas, and even covering some jurisdictions where there aren't all that many APA attorneys. How can the 80 to 100 APA bar organizations across the country be a good partner to the organizations like Advancing Justice?
Well, there's a lot of different ways. We work with some of the bar associations on our citizenship programs. We work with them on some of our immigration programs. So there's always a synergy around different services. There's also been cases where we've called on bar associations to help us with a case. Sometimes it's the bar association trying to find a good firm within the association to work on that case with us. So there's a lot of different ways to work together. Our organization has had people who have been in all of the different bar associations. And so I think there's been a real close relationship. I think that should continue, and people need to talk with each other, communicate, try to figure out where we can work together even more closely.
All right. Thank you so much, Stewart.
Thank you. Thank you.
That was wonderful, and thank you for all you do.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for coming here.
Yeah.